Hi, everyone. I'm Elaine Quijano. It's been 18 years since 9/11. In response, the government created the Department of Homeland Security to address the greatest threats facing our nation. 3 former Homeland Security secretaries sat down with CBS Evening news anchor and managing editor Norah O'Donnell to talk about the impact of September 11th. Here is Norah's full exclusive interview with Jay Johnson, Michael Chertoff, and Janet Napolitano from the 9/11 Memorial in New York City.
Are we safer now than we were on 9/11?
We're safer now, I believe, when it comes to a large-scale terrorist attack like 9/11 launched from overseas. I think our government does a much better job now of detecting overseas threats. I think that our government and an international coalition has done an excellent job of taking the fight directly to al-Qaeda, core al-Qaeda, and the Islamic State. Where we're challenged now is the day-to-day smaller scale attacks that we see far too many of, particularly right-wing violent nationalism, what we refer to as the terrorist-inspired attack, where a lone actor sees something on the internet and is inspired to commit an act of mass violence. That's today's threat that we have to be concerned about, in my view, principally.
Yeah, I would agree with Jay that in terms of the type of attack we experienced on 9/11, we've really mitigated that threat. But threats and risks continue to evolve, and the types of risks that we've seen evolve since then involve cyber, involve the lone wolf, the kind of inspired by social media lone wolf actor, involve the effects of global warming and climate change in terms of things that directly affect the safety of the American people.
Has DHS, Homeland Security, evolved to meet changing threats?
I think they're in the process of doing that. I mean, we've, for example, gotten much more operational at DHS on the issue of cybersecurity, and we reformulated those elements of the department that were focused on that to be more nimble. I think now the department is beginning to step up to look at the issue of what we sometimes call domestic terrorism, which is ideologically motivated terrorists who carry out these small-scale attacks. But then the latest thing we're going to have to focus on is how do we protect against campaigns designed to undermine our elections? And that's going to be the challenge, I think, for the next year.
Secretary Johnson, how do you view the agency right now?
I have to say, I view the agency with a fair amount of despair and dismay. I think our old agency has become overly politicized. It is overwhelmed with the immigration mission, which is itself overly politicized, very, very emotional, such that the American public often forgets that DHS is there day to day to protect the American homeland and to protect the people, land, sea, and air, and in cyberspace. And those are missions around which politics should matter very little. But the department in its entirety now is vilified, I'm afraid to say, in many places. There are politicians who openly call for the elimination of certain components of DHS, if not DHS in its entirety. And so my hope is that we can tamp down the rhetoric when it comes to Homeland Security, when it comes to immigration, and remind the American people of the important mission this department we led actually has in their day-to-day lives.
Secretary Napolitano, are you dismayed by the state of DHS?
Well, the men and women who comprise the professional staff of DHS, I think, remain a solid core, and their work needs to be appreciated. What I worry about is the instability at the leadership levels. The number of vacancies in the Senate-confirmed positions, the constant inflow and outflow, that does contribute to the over-politicization of what should be our most apolitical of departments.
Secretary Chertoff, the head of Homeland Security, the head of FEMA, all the agencies overseeing immigration have acting leaders, not confirmed. How does that hamper or hurt our national security?
I think it is a challenge to our national security to have people who are in an acting capacity in many of the leadership roles. Now look, these are good people. I know many of them served when I was there, and they're professionals. But the reality is, if you don't have a Senate confirmation, you're living day to day. And that affects not only your ability to plan strategically, but the way in which you're received by other agencies, other departments, and even other countries.
Is it unprecedented to have that many heads of these agencies not confirmed?
One of the roles of a cabinet secretary or the head of a senior agency is to tell the president something he doesn't want to hear. Tell the president what he needs to hear. When you are a Senate-confirmed presidential appointee, you have a certain amount of job security to do that an acting just doesn't have. And so my concern with so many vacancies, and they're very capable people in these jobs, they just don't have the job security, and they live day to day, and they don't necessarily tell the president what he needs to hear that needs to be done in Homeland Security.
Well, in fact, President Trump says he likes these acting secretaries.
He has virtually said that. He likes having people in acting roles because it's sort of a trial for the real job. And that's a disservice to the president, actually, because he's not getting the best advice that he needs to hear.
So at the end of the day, though, does that hurt our national security, our homeland security?
I think in the short term, probably not, in the sense that the people who are running things, I say, are by and large professionals and have operational experience. What it does do is affect the strategic ability to plan ahead, to look at the kinds of investments you need to be making now to deal with emerging threats a year from now or a couple of years from now.
Do you think the divisive nature of our politics today, the inability for people to work together, is hurting our country's ability to protect itself from threats?
I do. I think that the fact that everybody has gone to their corners and there's no apparent serious look to see where common ground can be found affects so many issues, but security issues are among those, and I do think it makes us, in a way, less safe.
Day to day, there are 230,000 people in the Department of Homeland Security. In uniform, Coast Guard, customs officers, TSA agents, we all know them, who do their job irrespective of who the president, who the Secretary of Homeland Security is, on the front lines. But Mike and Janet are both right. When you have so much divisiveness and so many vacancies, it does affect the ability at the top to lead and to stay ahead of the curve. I used to tell my people, don't just respond to the last terrorist attack. We have to be thinking about the next one. And that's why strong leadership is so important.
What is the biggest national security threat?
I think cyber is an area we have to be very concerned about. We've seen it in other parts of the world, an escalation of cyber attacks. We've seen it in this country with ransomware. And then the second big issue, I do think, is this effort to undermine the integrity of our elections and to sow dissension using social media, often driven by foreign adversaries, in order to weaken our unity of effort.
Secretary Napolitano, what is the biggest national security threat in your mind?
I'll give you three. Cyber, the effects of global warming, and mass gun violence, mass casualty events caused by a domestic terrorist.
First and foremost, climate change, climate change, climate change. The effect of severe weather, particularly on aging infrastructure in this city and in other places in the Northeast.
You all serve different presidents, bipartisan, Democratic, Republican, and you all agree climate change is a big threat.
Yes.
Yes.
You know, when you sit in the same chair and you have the same responsibilities, even if you're appointed by a Republican or a Democrat, we end up seeing the world in remarkably similar practical ways. And so Mike and Janet and I probably agree on 90%, simply because we see the world, and we have seen the world through similar terms, and we've all had the same people work for us, wrestling with the same issues.
When you sit in this job as Secretary of DHS, you have to be reality-based. And all this went through floods, hurricanes, fires, similar kinds of catastrophes. And that's real. You can't pretend it's not there, and it has a real impact on people.
And that's caused by climate change.
It seems to be, yeah. It seems to be intensifying and becoming more unpredictable.
And not just that, when people say, well, I don't understand, how does climate change affect Homeland Security? What are some real-world examples?
Well, for example, if your Homeland Security is the safety of the American people, take the extreme drought in the far western states, leading to forest fires. We lost in California an entire town last year with dozens of fatalities. Those kinds of events are increasing in frequency and severity as a result of the warming of the planet. And you're right, the fact that we have aging infrastructure makes us less resilient to the extreme weather events that occur. And moreover, when you're talking about global warming as a whole, that affects migration patterns, that affects areas of the world where the agricultural economy has been lost, and therefore they are perhaps more ripe for the rise of terrorism, terrorist recruitment. So there are all kinds of downstream effects from global warming.
You're watching CBSN's extended coverage on the anniversary of September 11th. When we return, Secretaries Jay Johnson, Michael Chertoff, and Janet Napolitano will continue discussing some of the toughest security problems still facing the U.S. today. You're streaming CBSN. Welcome back to CBSN's extended coverage on September 11th, 18 years later. Three former Homeland Security secretaries sat down for an exclusive interview together to discuss the greatest threats to national security. They met with CBS Evening news anchor and managing editor Norah O'Donnell at the 9/11 Memorial in New York City.
It's been 18 years since 9/11. We're here at this very solemn memorial. The threat has changed dramatically. We face increasing homegrown threats. What's happened?
This is something that I think each of us has talked about now for some time. The terrorist threat to our homeland has evolved significantly over the last 18 years from what I refer to as terrorist-directed attacks to smaller scale, terrorist-inspired attacks, inspired either by a terrorist group overseas or by extreme right-wing violent nationalism. In fact, that type of attack is now outpacing attacks inspired by foreign terrorist organizations. And so, in my view, when you ask for the solutions, the top solution is simply gun safety, consistent with the Second Amendment, making it harder for a dangerous individual to get his hands on a weapon, particularly an assault weapon.
We've seen this rise in domestic terrorism. We don't understand well how a person goes from reading something on social media to going out and buying a combat-ready weapon. But what we do understand is access to combat-ready weapons and these super large magazines can convert even a single casualty event into a mass casualty event. And that's where the gun safety issue becomes relevant.
Do you think there's any consensus on that within government about dealing with it?
You know, I think there's some consensus. I think from the polling, it looks like universal background checks has a lot of support. It's hard for me to see why people would object to limiting the size of magazines. Why do you need 100 rounds in a magazine? I agree with Jay, you want to respect the Second Amendment, but that doesn't mean an unlimited access to weapons.
The acting head of Homeland Security, Kevin McAleenan, has admitted that his department does not have the resources it needs in order to combat this threat from white supremacy. Has the department been too slow to evolve to meet that threat?
I do think they are now focused on getting some more resources and reinvigorating a grant program that would help deal with this issue. This is not an issue in which DHS can operate by itself. It's got to be done in conjunction with local law enforcement and also with local social services, because you've got to be able to ideally intervene before somebody picks up a gun and get them deprogrammed at an earlier stage. And that's a team effort. That's not one department.
We started down this road in 2016 with grants to local organizations dedicated to countering violent extremism, including violent extremism from the extreme right. And it was a start. I'm afraid that this administration has not paid enough attention to it and is only now playing catch up.
My understanding is that in national security cases with an overseas connection, the FBI can obtain secret surveillance warrants. And there are some saying that if a different classification for these types of domestic terrorism cases would give law enforcement some additional tools.
You have to be very careful because you're dealing with the First Amendment domestically, which does not apply outside this country. And also there are a series of rules about the Fourth Amendment, our constitutional right to privacy, that apply in the U.S. or to U.S. citizens. So I think it's a mistake to try to create an equivalence between what we do when we're dealing with overseas adversaries and what we do with domestic threats.
But if you talk to officials at the FBI, they say we don't have some of the tools that we would like in order to prevent and then prosecute these domestic terrorism cases. What's the answer?
Well, I think the FBI should be heard on that. I would pay very close attention if they feel as though they don't have the adequate tools to conduct an investigation. I agree with Mike. We need to be careful not to go down the road of criminalizing speech or criminalizing an ideology. It's when it turns violent that the federal government, federal law enforcement very definitely has a role.
And at the same time, Secretary Johnson, you said today that violence in this country inspired by right-wing extremism outpaces the violence inspired by ISIS or Al-Qaeda. That should be a wake-up to every American.
It should be. It should have been for a while now. And it's up to our political leaders to sound that alarm. It's up to those who have the biggest microphone. Not us. We're private citizens. It's up to those with the biggest microphone to sound this alarm, to make sure that the national government's efforts are adequately funded and there's enough energy and attention behind it.
And isn't most of this right-wing extremism being inspired by stuff that is read online?
A lot of it is online. And the challenge is, how do you not impair the First Amendment and free speech and yet suppress what crosses the line into incitement, where somebody actually says, go out and carry out an attack. And to be honest, that's a delicate issue. And before we jump into it with both feet, we need to first be sure we're not going to overreact.
I mean, let's turn to this issue of radicalizing online, because President Trump said after the recent El Paso attacks, the internet has provided a dangerous avenue to radicalize disturbed minds. How do we stop this from happening without trampling on First Amendment rights?
First, Norah, I believe that our political leaders have a role here to lower the levels of the sharpness in our political rhetoric, to restore levels of civility in the rhetoric. One of the things that I think is new is when one of these guys who gets arrested leaves a manifesto that spouts a lot of right-wing violent ideology. You just can't help but get the impression that in their deranged mind, there are some in our political leadership who would endorse what they are attempting to do. And so I think it's up to our political leaders to lower the temperature on the dialogue, because when you say things that were previously intolerable and make them tolerable, it lowers the bar for all of the rest of us in the American public. And for some, it makes violence inevitable.
As I said earlier, we really do not understand well what happens in a person's mind to go from reading something online to carrying out an actual attack. And maybe law enforcement is not the only approach. Public health, mental health also should be part of this calculus. And we should really devote some serious thought and resources into allowing us to identify better predictors for these actors so that earlier interventions can occur.
Is our government doing that now? Do you see leadership on that issue?
I think we need a lot more of it.
Yeah, we need more of it. I would also say the platforms have a role to play, because for some of these actors, part of the incentive to carry out an attack is to video stream it, and they become the star of their own YouTube video. The platforms have to be quick and thorough in knocking those things off the internet, because that actually is one of the things that's inspiring the most heinous kinds of acts.
I was just talking with the New Zealanders about this and what happened in New Zealand in terms of that attack being carried live on a couple of social media websites for a while before they were cut off.
Yeah.
That's right.
And maybe you need to do in social media what they used to do on TV, which is there was a slight delay before something was broadcast, so you could eliminate things that were obscene or inappropriate.
Look at how fast the government of New Zealand responded with added gun safety measures within days.
Let's turn now to the issue of cybersecurity. The former head of the Director of National Intelligence, Dan Coates, said the warning lights are blinking red when it comes to cyber threats. Are we prepared to deal with a cyber attack, and what could that look like for the average American?
I would say we're uneven. There are some parts of our economy that are relatively well prepared. Remember, most of the infrastructure is in private hands, so the private sector has to do a lot of the work. But other parts are not well prepared. If you want to see what it would look like to have a cyber attack, go look at the Ukraine. The last several years, you've had attacks that took down the grid for a period of time. You've had massive ransomware that was very destructive to businesses. And that's the kind of thing you could see in some circumstances here at home.
So one of the things, for example, local communities can do to mitigate the threat of these ransomware attacks is to make sure they have backup systems, that they're not solely dependent on their first network.
Cyber attacks, I believe, are going to get worse before they get better. We're still on defense. We're still struggling to keep up. And those of us on defense are faced with enemies who are increasingly aggressive, increasingly tenacious, increasingly ingenious.
You were the most recent Secretary of Homeland Security here amongst all three of you. Could a foreign government take down the power grid of a major city? And what kind of chaos would that create?
Well, first of all, each of us knows to be careful not to publicly speculate about what could happen, the worst case scenarios, because coming from a Secretary of Homeland Security, the public hears that in a certain way. But the thing I do worry about, and I'm sure Janet and Mike do too, is latent malware implanted in critical infrastructure, because critical infrastructure is increasingly interconnected and dependent upon each other. And so the private sector, as all of us have been preaching, have a large role in this, and it has to be a public-private partnership. But latent malware is a big concern, and it should be.
Let's turn now to the integrity of our elections. We're now 14 months away from the next presidential election. How concerned are you that foreign governments are going to do everything they can to cause chaos?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say chaos is maybe overstating it, but I would say if you look both at what's gone on over the last several years, not just in the U.S., but in Europe and elsewhere, we should anticipate efforts to interfere with the electoral process. It might involve manipulation of social media by people, foreign agents pretending to be Americans, or artificially affecting the way searches play out. It could involve trying to tamper with or penetrate voter databases. It could involve even trying to interfere on election day with the ability of people, for example, to get transit to take them to the polls. So we have to look at all of these issues and be prepared.
I'll answer it two ways. In terms of our election infrastructure, I think that state election officials have done a lot of good work with the Department of Homeland Security over the last 3 years. That's all headed in a good direction. In terms of weaponizing something that is stolen in terms of fake news, the publication of extremist views by foreign actors, I think that is extremely difficult to get our arms around. And let's not forget, the election may be 14 months away, but the campaign is now. And we are probably, as we speak, suffering from the foreign influence on our democracy through pushing out extremist views and fake news.
I mean, we already know that in the 2016 election, the Russians' IRA was able to reach 126 million Americans through Facebook.
Yes.
Staggering.
Yes.
And there's no information that they have somehow said, oh, we're stopping now, we're not going to do it anymore, or that there are other state actors.
And I'm told, I met with a top intelligence official who said the Iranians and the Chinese are now also doing similar efforts.
Right. It's the Russians are the most blatant, but the Chinese and the Iranians play this game too. And a new thing to watch out for is so-called deep fakes, which is the use of artificial intelligence to completely fabricate what appear to be real video and audio clips of real people.
This was done against the Speaker of our House, Nancy Pelosi.
Yeah, now that was a crude version because it was really slowing up the speed of the clip. But imagine a completely fabricated clip that looked for all intents and purposes real. And one of the challenges is, how does the mainstream media know whether this is something that's real and has to be rebroadcast, or whether it's fabricated and you don't want to propagate it?
It puts a special onus, I think, on broadcasters
Correct.
to make sure that that's not rebroadcast.
And a lot of it has to be on the American public themselves to be more skeptical and to be more scrutinizing of the information that is pushed at them in the internet age. It's no longer as it was when we grew up, where you were dependent upon 3 or 4 major news networks and your hometown newspaper and a national paper to get your news, where there are a lot of barriers to entry and standards in journalism for exit. And so it's really also on the American public to simply be more careful about what it is they decide to embrace as fact.
Let me turn to the issue of Afghanistan. Does a lack of a peace deal with the Taliban threaten our national security?
I actually have some experience with this from my days at the Department of Defense. First, what we used to say in the Pentagon, repeating the Taliban, is we may have the watches, but they have the time. They can afford to wait us out until the political pressure is such that we simply leave and go home. I think that the fundamental mission in Afghanistan has to be maintaining a presence there at some level to prevent another terrorist organization from setting up a caliphate there. I also believe that fundamental to any agreement has to be an agreement between the Taliban and the Afghan government. If they're going to continue to fight each other and the Taliban is going to continue to refuse to acknowledge that government at some level, it seems to me there's little point in us trying to cut a deal with the Taliban itself.
I would say that from a national security standpoint, not having a deal is not the issue. A bad deal would be the issue. A deal that doesn't allow us to continue to make sure that terrorists do not establish safe havens would actually put us at risk.
Well, and finally, let's recognize that the Taliban's records on things like women's rights, human rights overall, is frankly, it's awful. And so what protections will be built in any deal for the people of Afghanistan itself after our country having invested so many lives and so many dollars there?
Was that a mistake to invite the Taliban to Camp David?
Well, you know, this president likes to go for the big event. And my concern is that before you get there, there's a whole lot of work that has to be done beforehand to solidify agreements before the president himself puts himself on the line to shake hands with someone who has been our enemy for the last 18 years since this attack on 9/11.
That has killed our men and women in the military.
A lot more work needs to be done. And we saw this fall apart at the very last minute because it was so fragile. A lot more work has to be done. We've been working at this for years. And a lot more pieces, in my judgment, have to fall into place, particularly an agreement between the government there and the Taliban of some type.
And at best, in terms of this most recent failure, certainly the invitation was premature.
You know, when you come to this memorial, you remember 9/11 and the days and weeks after, and I was in government, I was involved in counterterrorism at that point. What strikes me is the unity that the country felt. And that's the strongest part of America, when we all come together. The second thing I would say is, during my time at DHS, I did have the opportunity to go to Camp Victory in Iraq and swear in immigrants to become U.S. citizens as they wore the uniform of the U.S. Army and had been out in the field fighting for this country. And that reminds you that what makes Americans is not national origin or ethnicity or religion, but it's dedication to American ideals and the American spirit.
You know, 9/11 happens to be my birthday, and I'm a New Yorker. I was here on 9/11/01. My office was in Midtown. I watched these two towers collapse. It was a moment in my life when I couldn't believe what my eyes were telling my brain. And then 15 years later, we rededicated the federal government's presence here to One World Trade Center, and my office was on the 50th floor of One World Trade, leading a department that didn't exist on 9/11.
Well, thank you all. Thank you for doing this here. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, Norah.
You've been watching an extended special with CBS Evening News anchor Norah O'Donnell and former Homeland Security secretaries reflecting on the events of September 11th. You can watch the exclusive interview anytime on CBSNews.com. We'll have more news after the break. You're streaming CBSN.